Welcome to Resilient Waters, Healing in the 10,000 Lakes. I'm Amy. Let's get connected. In today's episode, I can't wait to introduce you to Izaak Davison-Kerwood, licensed professional clinical counselor. Izaak has worked as an outpatient therapist for 5 years and an inpatient mental health provider for 3. He began his career with a focus on schizophrenia. For the past 3 years, Izaak has worked at Calm, treating and assessing complex ADHD cases. He has developed and run groups throughout his career, working with public mental health. Izaak is currently working towards his doctorate in clinical psychology. Hi, Izaak. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Amy.
Oh, it's been so great working with your clinic and doing these podcast episodes. And I'm so excited to share all of the very niche pieces that you bring to Calm today.
Excellent. Yeah. I'm happy to talk about it all. I'm excited to get into it.
Great. So let's just start with, how did you come to your clinical focus?
Yeah. So, kind of meandered around, I think, for a while. My current clinical focus is a pretty strong emphasis on treating adults with ADHD, of kind of a wide range. I would say a majority of my practice is working with adults or adolescents with what's referred to as kind of, or thought of as, like, complex ADHD cases. I started my work in residential care with adults with severe mental illness, and I worked as a individual therapist or mental health counselor with them for about 3.5 years or so before getting into outpatient therapy. And in that time, it kind of started as a generalist, but I think that early experience of, like, that recovery and housing first focused model really impacted my work and kind of continued to impact my work till today. That idea of, it's not just treatment, but it's about management, or what I like to think of as, like, symptom integration with our lives. Because with a lot of these things, and I think especially how this has impacted how I work with my clients now, is that if we think of, let's say, ADHD as a problem, actually I had a client put it just the other day really well. Like, if this kind of basic brain structure is a problem, well, then I'm kind of screwed, right? And I don't have anything to do. And so that idea of, yes, we need to find ways to manage these certain things, right? But instead of a kind of a treatment model, more of a recovery model, kind of a long-term integration of these are maybe my own idiosyncrasies and how to pull that into my life, I think has been a huge influence kind of over the arc of my career up until now.
Yeah, it's, you talked about this when we first talked before about shame-based language is not helpful in our field. And this is part of that work, is recognizing that we're taking people where they're at, but there's no shame in where we're at and where we're moving to. I love the way that you talk about this. I learn so much whenever we chat.
Yeah. Well, I think that, the element of shame and how that integrates with a lot of diagnoses, but I think ADHD specifically is something that's really under prioritized or can be missed often if we just focus on ADHD, especially if we focus on the ADHD as if it's a problem.
Right. No, I think that's great. And I think I read too that kind of in your early experience, you'd worked with, like, schizophrenia and things like that. You feel like that kind of shaped some of this work as well, working with different.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of that component of, like, the integration and that, like, long-term care piece, I think, especially. And partly because, a big, I think, influence on my work from that is schizophrenia was a focus of my study in my master's program. And initially when I started in the field, I was pretty dead set on continuing to work in that category. And I still, I love working with that population, but the idea of schizophrenia, and specifically if we look at, like, the different cultural impacts of that diagnosis, is fascinating. How clients typically in Western culture have a different development of the disorder. It kind of goes gradually slow, and then it lasts usually a lifetime, compared to clients in different cultures who seem to have a sometimes a much faster onset, kind of hits them harder, but then they have the symptoms completely remit over time, or they have the symptoms change in how they develop in terms of some of the intrusive. There's some really interesting research of clients who are in cultures that are more supportive of, if you're hearing voices, the hallucinations they experience are positive, right? And so they're less likely to show up in the clinic because they're literally just having positive self-talk, right? They're having these positive, and then it's not a problem, right? And so, depending on the who they're surrounded by, that can have a big impact. But what was really interesting to me early on was how people who are exposed in cultures where having voices, as an example, is a problem, it's not necessarily the hallucinations that people would report being the hardest part, but the negative symptoms and the social isolation and the withdrawal, the loss of hope, really, that, I mean, from what I could tell, was one of the biggest issues with clients. So some of the best therapy I did in terms of residential work was, talking to people while also, getting them to go through a drive-through with me at McDonald's, right? And things like that, because we were able to do more kind of out in the community kind of work. And that kind of relationship building, I think, went a whole lot farther than specifically targeting symptoms and treating them as if they needed to get rid of those symptoms. And I think that same approach of focusing on integration and how to work with, in essence, what our mind gives us and our own kind of differences as individuals, I think has continued to apply to how I approach ADHD and shame-based treatment today.
Oh, I love hearing you talk about this. It is so fascinating. There's so many things that I didn't know about that, but makes so much sense when you talk, when I think about neurology and how the brain is and functions and development, I think about the fact that, that makes so much sense that if we look at the brain as, oh, this is just how that brain is, right? Because we all come in different shapes, forms, and then we take that and go, well, let's give it a good environment to be the best that it can be. And it can function very healthy in any way, and in the way that we want things to grow, right? That's just fascinating to me. I love that. I guess I hadn't heard some of the research on culture and how that looks differently with different diagnoses. So I can see how that really shaped your work today too, and the way that you talk about it.
Yeah, those influences, I think, even now it still is interesting to think back at, like they really have a strong impact. And again, when we think about the emotional purpose of shame, at least in some ways, I like to think of it as a psychological rigidifier, right? It's the emotional equivalent of don't go there, right? Don't experience whatever that is. And at least from the perspective of some therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, which the whole goal of that therapy is psychological flexibility, then I think it really lays it out kind of clearly. Shame is a personality rigidifier. Yeah. And then if the goal of therapy is increased flexibility, then we really need to target shame in the individual when that shows up.
Right. Giving that possibility for something different.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So important if you want some change in your life. I love hearing this. I want to make sure that we keep talking about a little bit of this, but let's talk a little bit then about what are the clients that you serve today? Who typically do you see in your office and what does that look like?
Yeah. So the vast majority of clients I see today are clients who are struggling in one form or another with something that it could be related to ADHD or kind of that attentional management. I see a lot of clients, again, the clinic I'm through is predominantly focused on diagnosing and treating ADHD. So I see a lot of those kinds of cases. And in addition, though, I also see people who are kind of in the gray area, right? Which I think is an important part of this, about how anxiety or OCD has a sort of a partial overlap, at least in how these symptoms present in folks. And so certainly a large part of my work involves working with folks like that. So if I had to break it down numbers wise, though, I'd say about 75% of my clients would be diagnosed with ADHD, and the remainder often will come at least questioning that. And also part of our work sometimes is sussing out, well, is this is this ADHD or is it something different? And what does that mean for that person, right? If that's the case. And I would think that probably as my career continues, given how much I like working with this population, I'll probably stay in that percentage as I move forward. And that's partly what led to me forming the adult ADHD group at Calm.
Oh, please tell me more about this.
Yeah. So
I know a little bit, but I want to make sure everybody gets the full details on this because I'm so excited.
Yeah, I really began wanting to form. I mean, really, when I started at Calm a few years ago, I began thinking about some of the research recommendations for treating ADHD. Often include a little blurb at the end of a lot of like evidence-based practice is like social support groups for ADHD, partly because of the role and element of shame in the disorder, which we'll come back to with how it's relevant in the group. But so that got me wanting to form the group in the first place. The group really is structured in kind of a combination. Again, what's fun about treating and working with ADHD, therapeutically fun, I always like to say, because it's not actually fun for the clients always, but
Right.
it's that it's a balance of people come in and they will often, at least when people are early on, I'd say in their therapy journey, they come in, they want nuts and bolts kind of ideas, which is great, right? How do I improve my organization? How do I not lose important documents? How do I show up on time for my kids? All those are really practical things that very quickly get into some areas of discrepancy in their lives, or some areas of discomfort. In other words, I want to show up for my kids, like I mentioned at the end of the example, but I keep showing up late. And then how does that impact me? How do I sit with that discomfort in terms of not being able to act on my values? And that usually over time is what seems to propagate the experience of shame for the people that I work with. And so the group is a bit sneaky in that we start off in kind of the initial modules with, I meet people where they're at in the sense of, okay, if you want to talk about organization, we talk about organization. Mm-hmm. Then slowly, and actually pretty quickly in a lot of my groups these days, we get into talking about what's it like to, on one hand, really value something, but on the other hand, struggle to apply it at times. And what messages have we received over the course of our lifetime that has led to us shaping some ideas about ourselves, right? Yeah. This is usually where the role of shame comes in. Because as some of the providers here have talked about, Dr. Tom does a great job of framing it, is with ADHD, often our core abilities and our core kind of cognitive skills are greater than what I refer to as our secondary abilities, right? So we can often, the saying that I've been told that I like a lot is people with ADHD can run very well, they suck at crawling, right? Right. of the tedious or maybe the not as engaging tasks. And so that discrepancy people often feel, and especially when we're young, we conclude that, oh, well, the reason that there's a gap is because there's something wrong with me, right? Or I'm lazy, or some variation of I'm bad. And that is, I think, more, I don't want to say more relevant, but it comes up a lot when we're trying to treat ADHD in adults, because a lot of people have tried planners a million times. So I've seen so many clients who have 30 planners, right, by the time they start therapy. But often what happens when they sit down to do that is they run into blockers. And those blockers are almost always related to some of these narratives, right? Some of these core experiences of shame.
Right. There's that rigidity you were talking about, and then trying to build the place for the flexibility in your work.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, so cool to see groups actually pop up for this, because I think the model can be hard to start. I love that the recommendations are out there, but yeah, to actually have that available. So can you tell us, for clients who would want to get involved in a group, let's say there's someone listening who has a diagnosis, but they're like, hey, that sounds like something I'd really like to get involved in. How do they do that? Yeah. Where do they look?
So it's a great question. So Calm website is a good place to look up. Also, with a name spelled like mine, it's kind of like a barcode. So you can look up Izaak, Izaak therapist, and you'll find me immediately, whether or not that's good. But also, looking at even online, there's resources, I believe, through Attitude magazine for online groups nationally, right? But even just contacting Calm in our main line to get set up with a group. The way that the process works, if they chose to work through my group, would be they'd reach out. Either I or our staff would schedule an initial interview just to kind of see where they're at, what they're looking for in terms of the group. ADHD groups work really well for clients who are using the group as, if they're using it as their primary treatment modality, that's fine. It's just that often with groups, there's that interaction between people is the main focus. And so it takes a lot of motivation. It takes a lot of kind of extra work outside of the group. Most of my group clients use it as an adjunct therapy. So they have their individual therapist and then they have the group that they go to. And if you're looking to have a group where you can explore, essentially what I hear is most helpful from the group members of, like, is this normal? I mean, is the most common thing I hear, right? Like, is this something I am alone with experiencing? And what does that mean? Or is this something that other people have gone through? And what's really cool about the ADHD group is people can see how people have responded to some of these like kind of core challenges of struggling, let's say, to manage where your attention goes. Because it's not that like people with ADHD have less attention. It's just that it's harder to direct where it's being pointed at, right, over time. And so what we see is also this really interesting thing of we might have some group members who become overly rigid and overly perfectionistic in response to trying to manage their attention limitations. And then due to that same problem, you might have someone who's the complete opposite, who sort of is more procrastinating, or they might avoid certain struggles. But what's really cool is seeing people who are able to be on different ends of the spectrums and how they cope, but have the same problem and be able to meet in the middle as they're talking to each other and acknowledging that problem. And that's where I think a lot of the, I guess you kind of say the magic of the actual treatment of the group comes in, and then being able to kind of connect over those things and share ideas, right? Because practically we're here to get better, right? And share different interventions.
Yeah.
And honestly, some of the group members have come up with things that I would never think of, right? And so like a lot of what actually works, I think, can be improved, right? By having people in our lives who we can share this stuff with.
Yeah, like struggles, but yet also managing in different ways. I do like, as a clinician, that model of being able to do a group and then also individual, so that you get that group, different experience and be able to get that, but then also sometimes processing that alone can be helpful too with a therapist. So yeah.
And that's something that my kind of almost favorite dynamic sometimes is working with a client individual who's also in the group, because that's a really fun way to kind of almost tie things over. And honestly, I see a lot more in follow through from the therapist angle. If you get advice from a peer, it seems like it's going to hit much closer to home than if you get advice from a therapist sometimes, right?
Yep.
And that is some of the most gratifying things. One of my favorite things I actually heard recently from a group was one group member mentioned that they were talking as on the elevator down and on the walk back to their car, kind of processing the group together, and they came up with some mutual ideas. And I'm like, that's perfect, right? That kind of organic coming up with solutions together is huge. And again, inadvertently, what that's doing, hopefully at least, is treating and reducing the experience of shame, and hopefully increasing that flexibility over time. Because I don't know a better way to treat shame other than try to bring it out to the light and kind of carry it together, right? Share it with other people and not be so alone in these experiences. I mean, we could talk about that for a while, but especially if you got later in life, right? A lot of shame can be built up around those things.
No, absolutely. I always think about, because, and I've said this too in other podcasts, I work with trauma. And so I'm always looking at things through a trauma lens and with PTSD and things like that. And I think about how it dawned on me and one of my trainings that in development, in adolescence, if we are not connecting with our peers and getting those messages that we belong or we fit in here, that it's actually very traumatic on our system. Like, that is a trauma on us. And so I think so much about those who are diagnosed with like ADHD or autism spectrum or something like that, where they probably got those messages of shame pretty heavily in those areas, in those years of life. And that's so difficult to work with. I don't think I've ever seen a case of someone who was diagnosed with ADHD, but then didn't have trauma response.
Yeah.
Right. So it just very much goes hand in hand. So I love this, this framework that you guys have set up, that you have set up in therapy. It's wonderful. I'm so happy that I can help get this information out for people. So I had a question about accessibility for the groups and things. I am assuming, but I want to ask, is this in person only, or is there online options for others? I know you had mentioned maybe added ADD Attitude Magazine. I'll make sure to link that too.
Yeah, they have some national sort of offerings. I would, to put it in this way, if I could run this group full time, I would run this group full time. And so right now we have an in-person availability. We have a wait list for some telehealth group members. And so it's flexible. We have a very large screen TV that people can sort of zoom into if we did a hybrid group. The group started off as pure telehealth, and the way I structure and lead groups is I try to, again, the interaction between group members is the real treatment efficacy. So what I try to do is leave group decisions up to the group. And so for one group, as an example, that's now in person, they started off telehealth. They began talking about shifting to in-person. I'm happy to accommodate. And then now we do Saturday mornings in person in that group. That's an example. Wednesday afternoons is currently a wait list for a hybrid group, right? Clients are interested. So it's fairly flexible. It's just based on client need or preference.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. Very cool. Okay. So I also wanted to check in with, I think in other podcasts, we've talked a little bit about how do we access the services as far as insurance and things like that. So is it a little bit different, or is it the same as the clinic takes, I think, just Blue Cross Blue Shield? What does that look like for pay for people?
Yeah, so right now, just Blue Cross Blue Shield through the clinic. I am working on, in my own private practice, getting licensed with all the big ones. So Health Partners, UHC, things like that. So for all those listeners, stay tuned, hopefully sooner than later. And yeah, other than that, we also offer, a sort of super bill service, right? If clients would like, or a sliding scale. Again, I would prefer to lead the group than not. And so we try to be pretty flexible based on client needs. I think out of pocket right now, it is about $75 to $50, depending on, client income, things like that. But I'm also working on applying for grant funding through Minnesota. So, depending on how that goes as well, anything just to get the group up and running and provided on a consistent basis is at least my stance.
That's so great. If there's changes to that, feel free to email me and I will update in the summary section of the podcast as things change. If that works for you, that way people can kind of know a snapshot maybe of like, oh, this might be possible. I have Health Partners or whatever it is.
Yeah. I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
Awesome. Very cool. And then also making sure to remind people that it's individual therapy and group therapy that you offer as well.
Yes.
And then I think we had talked about before, you are still part of assessments as well.
Yeah.
Is that, do you want to talk a little bit about how that process may look different, or what that process looks like for people?
Yeah. So the way that they can do, so it's kind of a both and, right? They can certainly do the kind of classic assessment. Calm is predominantly an assessment clinic. I am very happy that I'm part of the team as essentially their only like primary therapist. But I think they're working on including more of that as they go. And one thing that is nice is that they are sort of creating a manualized treatment based on this group that they will use for future clinicians. So hopefully we'll have that consistency, which will be great. Yeah. And the way that I do assessment services or working with me doing assessment that's a little different is I do what's referred to as, I have some training in therapeutic assessment. So essentially this just integration of some assessment services into the therapy. If I was giving someone a straight eval, then we would just do a straight eval, right? But usually how I do assessment through Calm is sort of as needed or as the therapy is progressing, doing an assessment, doing a clinical interview, and then discussing those results as we're also kind of getting the feedback and going through the therapy process. It can be really helpful to be like, oh, you answered this on question 99 of this 300 question survey. Like, what are your thoughts about that, right? This is how it influenced your score. And being able to talk to clients and walk them through the results, I think, is a really nice sort of extra layer. It also focuses a lot more on a lot of assessment services, for plenty of good reason, are you sort of take the test and you just get the results. You don't really know what goes on in the background. Right. But what's nice about this kind of more integrated approach to assessment is you can it includes the clients on the process and the final decision making. And in my experience, that it really can increase a client's buy-in, right, to the diagnosis over time.
Yep.
And that's how I approach when I work with clients therapeutically. Same thing. I have it pretty dialed in now, where clients will start. We'll do a diagnostic, kind of a structured interview. I give them self-reports, and then I tell them my job is, and I think a lot of therapists do this, but my job is to try to rule out a list of diagnoses. And what I can't rule out, then I talk to the client as this seems to be the predominant diagnosis. And especially with things like ADHD, where they can have a lot of overlap with anxiety or depression or other kind of concerns. Trauma is a great example.
Yeah.
That kind of more discerning, transparent assessment process has, in my experience, been more helpful with clients over time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just on my end of when I refer for those things, it's usually over time, hey, we're still wondering about this piece that still trips us up sometimes. So maybe we need more clarification, and then we can have a discussion. I like the fact that you're in and part of those assessments, because that's a very individualized service that I don't think people are always going to get elsewhere. So that's really cool. And I'm sure very helpful for so many clients. Okay, so we talked about so much already, and I just want to make sure that we got through all of the things that you wanted to highlight in your practice right now. Is there, because you're offering a lot of different things, so I want to make sure that we got all of those out. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I think as far as my practice itself, the working through the group and the therapy and the assessment services, I think are the sort of the cut and dry or the Clip Notes version of it. But I think just really emphasizing for folks who are listening and kind of trying to understand how ADHD integrates with their life, this kind of intersection between the difficulty with attention and how that impacts the mood concerns people have is really often overlooked. And knowing, like you mentioned, how over time having ADHD can lead to lots of what are almost like these like small but persistent traumas, right? Yes. The ideas of kind of consistent rejection or rupture in relationships, or that discrepancy between this is what I value, but I struggle to apply it in my life. That I think is a huge factor for what can lead people to develop mood disorders. I mean, the other part is like the reason that anxiety and depression is more common with ADHD is it's kind of depressing or anxiety provoking to have ADHD in a culture that doesn't see that, right? And
yes,
these things are there's often that interrelationship. And something that I think is an interesting food for thought that I initially talk about with clients is that if you have a really shame-based thought, right, like there's something wrong with me. One of the more common things I hear from folks is like, to the brain at least, that's a very stimulating thought, right? It may not be positive, but that's really going to grab your attention, right? And I think that the issue with ADHD is that it's not just looking at things outside of yourself or inside yourself that are interesting that grab your attention, but it's also things that are stimulating and really engaging, even really painful things. I actually think especially painful things can really grab us in. And again, that is relevant because that's going to be a different approach basically on how you're managing if you have an anxious thought, if you have a depressing thought, than just, I just need to not think about this. Well, no, right? Those thoughts they are really engaging and they're going to pull you in. So how do you want to respond to that? And when you sit down and you're trying to do an organization worksheet your therapist gave you, right? Like when those thoughts of, well, I can't do this or this is going to help or whatever else it is come up, those are there for good reason, right? And how do you pivot to address those, right, without letting them dominate your attention? So there's a lot of moving parts, right, that can be hard to juggle.
It's very difficult to figure out all those parts. I could not have said this better. I could not have. That it was so well talked about right there. I just want to wrap it up as a gift and give it to a lot of people right now. That this is so the work. This is so what's hard about these diagnoses, about mental health, about neurology, and how we operate. Because they are stimulating. Those negative thoughts, those very difficult shaming things are so stimulating that our brain is going to gravitate towards those, especially with a diagnosis like ADHD. We're going to hold on to those. And then it's the work of, okay, well, what do I actually want that to look like? And what are the thoughts that I do want to hold on to that are a part of my values? And that sounds like you wrapped it up so well. It sounds so simple, but it is not. That is so hard. That is so hard work. I'm so thankful that I get to share this podcast with people so that they can get in touch with someone, a therapist like you, who can do that kind of work and understand it in such a deep, caring way.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like you're saying, it's a long, complicated process. But again, one thing that I love about working with ADHD in this population is like when you see people begin to change how they relate to these anxious or kind of shame-based thoughts, I mean, is one of the most gratifying things I think I see in my job. A common example, right, is shifting how people view some of this idea of the inner child, right? And I use that as a sort of a metaphor, right? Especially with shame. It's hard to, if you're a healthy, hopefully, functioning adult, it's hard to look at a 10-year-old and try to actively shame that 10-year-old, right? But if you think about yourself, when you experience these painful shaming experiences, you were a 10-year-old or younger, right? Oftentimes, at least. And seeing how people will relate to themselves, like whether it be through this lens of how I want to treat my inner child or how I want to think about this negative experience that happened to me over time. And when they have those shame-based thoughts come up, instead of reacting with, why am I thinking this way? Why am I like this? They soften and they think, well, it's going to be okay, right? Like I'm going to be able to sort of sit with this, or this is coming up because this was really scary or difficult for me in the past. So what am I going to do about that now? I think is a really encouraging. I mean, it always makes me, very assured I'm in the right job because it's really satisfying, right? And also for clients to have that pivot, I mean, is pretty amazing. I'm always surprised when clients are able to do that, just because it's like, there's this just shift that happens, right? Which is pretty exciting to see. And again, very, I think, similar to how you approach even like treating trauma over time, right? That
very
change,
similar.
Yeah, that change in the narrative of the experience, I think, is just huge. So I forget where I was going with that due to my own limited attention span at times. But I think that
sometimes I think as therapists, we get so wrapped up and excited in these wonderful moments that we kind of get lost in them. And I do this all the time. But I also know that for listeners who are hearing this, they're going to connect with what you're talking about and be so happy that you brought this up, and to see that passion that you have for the work that you're doing. That's why I do this podcast. That's why I want to make sure to get this out there, because I want potential clients or people to be able to see this work and go, that's the kind of person I want to work with and walk this journey with, because it's hard. And I think he gets it and you get it.
I mean, I'm happy to try, right?
Right. I can't remember the phrase that you used at the beginning when you were talking about how much you kind of love doing this. But it is very difficult for therapists to be like, I love working with trauma. I love working with shame.
Well, yeah. Therapeutically fun. Yeah.
Therapeutically fun. Right. Because it sounds not great, I think. But I love the way that you said that. I might steal that phrase from you because thank you. Because it's true. It's very true. It is that satisfying, oh my goodness, this was impactful and this is very helpful for people. And that's why I want to do this.
Absolutely.
That's why I want to stay in this space with people. So thanks for sharing that. We have a fun question that you had picked out to answer at the end of the podcast today. And I'm excited for this one because no one has picked this one yet. And it's one of my favorites because I think about it all the time. If you were able to create the ideal therapy space, what would it look like?
Yeah. So this one I enjoyed too because it's very timely. Because I have an office at home that is just mine, right? So that's a fun feeling for me. And I haven't known how to decorate it at all. And so I recently just leaned into it. It's just a ton of so many fake plants. It's just full of greenery.
It's important. That's important.
All I could land on. I think an ideal therapy office would have obviously a bunch of plants. I am a maximalist, I think, in how I approach things. So I'm a big fan, and again, probably due to the population I work with having lots of things, right, to look at, kind of let your mind drift to. I totally agree with some people that they want like a neutral space, but I think you can have cozy, and I think that's a good. So I'm a big fan of like large, comfortable couches. I always think like a little water feature in the background would be nice, something soothing. And I think an ideal therapy office, honestly, is something like a family living room situation, right? Where you walk in, it should feel like there's kind of a cohesive environment. It should feel organized and safe, right? And we want that to still be a priority. But I think having a feeling that it's like a lived in space, right? Because I think some of my least favorite offices, I'll put it like this, that I've worked in are places that feel clinical, right? And feel like they are, like it's fine if you share offices. It's fine if you have an office that's like, in a cubicle or whatever it is. Like that is what it is. But it doesn't have to, have that spirit that you bring in. And so, I have found over the years that I actually really enjoy decorating offices, and it's kind of a fun environment to try to build together. My clients, I like to think lovingly refer to my office decor right now. It's kind of a Midwestern mom aesthetic, which is fine with me, right?
I love it.
Because I hear that and I think it's cozy, right?
Yes.
That's the goal.
Welcoming, cozy.
And likely, ideally full of different art pieces. I also have training in the past. This might have been actually helpful to know too, as an art therapist. And I certainly bring that kind of, those interventions, that kind of spirit to a lot of this work. And so whether it be making art with clients and then but I even like seeing my own artwork, and like I will sometimes have an easel in my office space willing of something I do in between sessions, like a process piece. And it just makes the space feel alive, maybe is the nice way to say. And that's what you want in therapy. You want a living, breathing space, because that's the goal of therapy, right? Is to get people closer to a living, breathing, authentic life rather than, again, stay stuck in avoiding shame or stuck in the experience of shame.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad that you bring that up. I'm going to share something with you that has been really fun for me in my private space, because I get to kind of move things about every once in a while. But plants, yes, I'm all on board with the plant thing. So over this kind of like holiday season, I brought in this called an amarilla, and everybody's been able to watch it grow and bloom because it started off as nothing, and it's wrapped in wax, nice and cozy, and over every week it changes. So if people are in consistent sessions, they're able to kind of see the growth over time, which is a nice little therapeutic nod, right? That we're constantly changing. And we get to then decide how we do want to change. So that's been fun, but I'm all on board with the plants, fake or real. Bring them in. I think they're nice and cozy. That's awesome.
Absolutely. That's great. I like that. I mean, I might steal that.
Please do.
Having, again, that it's an interesting balance, right? Therapy, you want it ritualized, you want it to be the same. but also on the flip side, you want it to feel like change is happening, right? I think, again,
Yes.
therapy doesn't work. It's usually in some ways, at least one of the many reasons that people can run into obstacles is we get into a routine, right? Things get rigid, or again, I think a lot of the times, at least as a therapist, I know when I notice myself feeling like, oh, I shouldn't go there, whatever there is.
Yeah.
That's usually a sign of, okay, well, what's going on there, right? And I have to ask myself, like, are they bringing up my avoidance, or is that their discomfort in that? And what does that mean about the therapy? And so that's, again, having an environment that feels dynamic, yet is also stable and consistent. I mean, that's a really fun, again, balance to try to strike.
Yeah, I love that, because we get to use the therapeutic space as a way to move about in therapy, right? Like you were talking about the art piece, like these are all ways that we can utilize that and notice those stuck pieces that might be happening. I know there's even been modalities where people are like, all right, we're going to move the things in the room around.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
what does that feel like? And how do you want that to be? And there's so many pieces to that. So I'm so glad you brought this one up. That is such a fun topic. And I hope that your space feels even more cozy as you develop and change it and bring in more plants.
I think I will. There may be a limit. I was told recently that there needs to be space. But no, I think having that, and again, what I enjoy and the way I try to do therapy is very two-person oriented, right? This idea of like the clients are also active participants. So it's fun, especially working with clients who may feel harder to be connected with or things like that, to just ask them like, what do you think of the space, right? Should there be a throw rug, right? Again, simple ways to just connect and build some rapport. And again, make it feel ideally like it's their space too, right? Because it is. It wouldn't exist.
Yeah. Exactly. I don't know. I don't ascribe to this. There's too many plants. 3, 4, 5. I think I have 6. I have 6 in here. It's not a very big space. So go for it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I am thrilled to get this information out there, and everything that you talked about as far as resources, I promise to link in the summary of this podcast, wherever you're listening or seeing it. And yeah, that way you can get in contact with Izaak, or you can just Google his name, therapist in Minnesota, like you said. I love that. That's so great. Well, thanks so much for joining me today.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me talk, Amy, and hopefully this is helpful for folks.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
All right, guys, this is the legal stuff, the disclaimer. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only. The information provided is not a substitute for professional therapeutic advice or counseling. Always consult with a qualified mental health professional for any personal concerns or issues. The views expressed on this podcast are those of the host and guest and do not represent the views of any affiliated institution or organization. Listener discretion is advised.